Aryan Greyfen had dreamed of this night for as long as he could remember. Standing in the ceremonial circle of the Silver Blood Pack, surrounded by ancient stone pillars that had witnessed countless bonding rituals over the centuries, he felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with nervous excitement that had characterized his thoughts for weeks. At 21, Aryan was considered late for his bonding ceremony. But Omega werewolves often experienced their full maturity later than alphas and betas. His slight frame and delicate features had always marked him as Omega even before his scent had fully developed, and while some in the pack had whispered that he was too fragile for the heir of such a powerful bloodline, Aryan had never doubted that his destiny lay with Terran Wilmorn. The knowledge of their fated bond had come to him gradually, through dreams and instincts that grew stronger with each passing season. Terran was everything an alpha should be: tall, powerfully built, with the kind of commanding presence that made others instinctively submit. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his jaw strong and decisive, his eyes the color of storm clouds when his wolf was close to the surface. More importantly, Terran was the heir to the Silver Blood Pack, destined to become the next alpha leader when his father stepped down. The union between them would strengthen both their bloodlines and ensure the pack's continued prosperity for generations to come. The ceremony began with the traditional invocations, calling upon the moon goddess to bless their union and guide their steps in the years ahead. Aryan wore the customary white robes that marked him as an unbonded Omega, the fabric flowing around his slender form like captured moonlight. The silver circlet on his brow identified him as a member of the Greyfen line, one of the oldest and most respected Omega families in the pack's history. Around the ceremonial circle, hundreds of pack members had gathered to witness what many considered the most important bonding in a generation. The union between the alpha heir and the most promising Omega of his age group would herald a new era of strength and stability for the Silver Blood Pack. As the mystical energies built around the circle, Aryan felt the familiar tingling sensation that preceded the manifestation of fated bonds. This was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life, when the golden thread of their destined connection would become visible to all, proving that the moon goddess herself had chosen them for each other. But when the bond began to shimmer into existence, stretching across the circle to connect him with his destined mate, Aryan saw something in Terran's eyes that made his heart freeze with sudden terror. Not joy, not anticipation, not even nervous excitement, but disgust so pure and cold that it hit him like a physical blow. No! Terran's voice carried clearly across the circle, silencing the assembled crowd with its flat rejection. I will not bind myself to this mistake. The words struck Aryan like lightning, each syllable more devastating than the last. Mistake. That's what Terran called their bond, their destiny, everything Aryan had built his life around. But Terran? Aryan whispered, his voice barely audible over the shocked murmurs of the crowd. We're fated mates. The goddess chose us for each other. Then the goddess made an error, Terran replied with casual cruelty, striding across the circle with predatory confidence. I will not tie myself to a weak Omega who reeks of fear and inadequacy. I need a mate who can stand beside me in strength, not cower behind me in weakness. The alpha's greater height and bulk made Aryan seem even more fragile by comparison, emphasizing the physical disparity between them. But it was the emotional cruelty in Terran's words that truly broke something fundamental in Aryan's understanding of the world. Look at you, Terran continued, his voice loud enough for every pack member to hear clearly. You can barely stand upright under the weight of your own terror. How could I possibly respect a mate who trembles at the mere thought of being touched by an alpha? Aryan tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain that his nervousness came from anticipation rather than fear. But the words wouldn't come. His throat constricted with the growing realization that his deepest dreams were becoming his worst nightmare. With deliberate cruelty, Terran reached out and grasped the golden thread of their fated bond, something that should have been impossible for anyone but the bonded pair to touch. The thread pulsed with mystical energy, growing brighter and more solid as it strained against the alpha's grip. I reject this bond, Terran declared formally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I reject this connection. I reject any claim this Omega might have on my life or future. and I cast him out from among those worthy of an alpha's protection. The pain that followed was beyond anything Arian had ever experienced. As Terran tore the fated bond apart, it felt like having his soul ripped in half, leaving jagged edges that burned with every breath. He collapsed to his knees, a cry of pure agony tearing from his throat as the severed pieces of their connection fell to the stone floor like dying stars. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the pack members who had been murmuring among themselves fell quiet, shocked by the unprecedented cruelty of what they had just witnessed. Fated bonds were considered sacred, chosen by the moon goddess herself. To reject such a bond was not just socially unacceptable, it was spiritually dangerous. But Alpha Theron Wilmorn, Terran's father and the current pack leader, stepped forward with an expression of cold approval rather than the condemnation Arian had desperately hoped to see. "My son has shown wisdom in recognizing a flawed bond," Theron announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ceremonial circle. "The moon goddess sometimes tests us with connections that seem destined but prove to be mistakes. Terran has chosen the good of the pack over personal comfort, and I commend his strength." The casual dismissal of Arian's spiritual trauma as a mere inconvenience was somehow even more devastating than Terran's original rejection. This wasn't just about a failed bonding, it was about a fundamental denial of his worth as a person. "Remove him from the sacred circle," Theron commanded, gesturing to the pack warriors who stood at attention around the perimeter. "Let him be cast out from our territory, since he has proven himself unworthy of our protection and unfit for our community." As strong hands lifted Arian's convulsing form and carried him beyond the boundaries of the ceremonial space, he caught sight of his own family members in the crowd. His father looked away, unable to meet his eyes. His younger brother seemed frozen with shock and horror. But it was his mother's expression that dealt the final blow to his shattered heart. Not grief or outrage, but shame and disappointment. They were abandoning him, all of them, choosing the pack's approval over their own son's welfare. The exile was carried out with ruthless efficiency. Arian was given a small pack of supplies and escorted to the edge of Silver Blood territory, where he was formally banished from ever returning. The warriors who had once respected him as a future pack leader now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if his rejection had somehow made him physically repulsive. "Don't try to return," one of them warned as they prepared to leave him alone in the wilderness. "The Alpha's command is absolute. You're no longer one of us." As the sun set on the ruins of his old life, Arian found himself alone in the borderlands between pack territories. His body still racked with the spiritual pain of his severed bond, and his mind reeling from the complete destruction of everything he had believed about his future. The fated bond that was supposed to be his greatest blessing had become his curse. The love that was supposed to define his life had been revealed as a cosmic joke. The family that was supposed to support him had cast him aside like refuse. But as he stumbled through the gathering darkness, Arian began to understand that this wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning. The life he had been living, the future he had been preparing for, had been built on foundations that were ultimately illusory. Now, stripped of everything he had thought he wanted, he was free to discover who he really was and what he truly needed. The moon rose full and bright above the wilderness, casting silver light on a path that led away from everything familiar and into a future that was uncertain but entirely his own. And for the first time since his rejection, Arian felt something that might have been hope stirring in the depths of his despair. Chapter 2: The Depths of Exile. The borderlands were a harsh, unforgiving place where few creatures ventured willingly. These wild territories existed between the established domains of the major supernatural factions, claimed by none and governed only by the brutal law of survival. It was here that Arian found himself struggling to exist, his body still weak from the trauma of his severed bond and his mind fractured by the complete collapse of his understanding of the world. The first few days passed in a blur of physical and emotional agony. The pain of a severed fated bond was said to be one of the worst experiences a werewolf could endure, but Arian discovered that it was even more devastating when combined with the psychological trauma of public humiliation and family abandonment. His wolf form, which had always been his source of strength and comfort, became unstable and unpredictable. The transformation that should have been as natural as breathing now felt like a battle between conflicting aspects of his nature. Sometimes he would shift involuntarily, his human consciousness dissolving into pure animal panic. Other times he would become trapped between forms, experiencing the agony of incomplete transformation for hours at a time. The instability made hunting nearly impossible, and Arion found himself growing weaker with each passing day. He survived on berries and roots, what little game he could catch in his more stable moments, and water from streams that were often contaminated with runoff from the industrial settlements that dotted the borderlands. But it was the isolation that truly threatened to break him. Werewolves were pack animals by nature, designed to thrive in communities built around shared bonds and mutual support. The complete absence of that social structure left Arion feeling like a vital part of himself had been amputated, leaving him spiritually as well as physically incomplete. The nightmares were the worst part. Sleep brought no relief from his trauma, only vivid replays of his rejection and endless variations on the theme of abandonment. He would dream of returning to the pack only to be rejected again, or of finding acceptance elsewhere only to have it ripped away when his fundamental unworthiness was discovered. He began to understand why exiled werewolves rarely survived more than a few weeks in the borderlands. It wasn't just the physical challenges, it was the psychological impossibility of existing without the pack bonds that defined werewolf nature itself. It was during his third week of exile that the hunters found him. Arion was attempting to fish in a muddy stream when he heard the sound of approaching vehicles, heavy trucks that could navigate the rough terrain of the borderlands. His unstable wolf senses picked up the scent of predators, but not the familiar musk of werewolves or the cold mineral scent of vampires. These were something else entirely. The men who emerged from the trucks were human, but their equipment and tactics marked them as specialists in supernatural capture and containment. They moved with the confidence of those who had hunted creatures far more dangerous than a weakened Omega werewolf, their weapons designed specifically to incapacitate rather than kill. "There it is," one of them said, pointing toward where Arion crouched by the stream. "Matches the description from our intelligence network. Exiled Omega, probably worth a decent price to the right buyer." Arion tried to run, but his weakened condition and unstable transformation abilities made escape impossible. The hunter's nets were designed to prevent shape-shifting, and their tranquilizer darts were calibrated specifically for werewolf physiology. Within minutes, he found himself bound and caged in the back of one of their trucks, consciousness fading as drugs flooded his system. The slave markets of the borderlands were everything that civilized supernatural society pretended didn't exist. Here, beings who had fallen through the cracks of their respective communities were bought and sold like livestock, their value determined by their rarity, their abilities, and their potential for exploitation. Arion found himself in a cage barely large enough for his human form, surrounded by other captives who represented the full spectrum of supernatural society's outcasts. Vampires who had been cast out from their clans, fae who had lost their connection to the mystical realms, even a few werewolves like himself who had been abandoned by their packs. The conditions were appalling. Minimal food and water, no medical care, and the constant threat of violence from both guards and other prisoners. But perhaps worst of all was the way the captives were treated as objects rather than people, their individual stories and personalities reduced to simple categories that determined their market value. Werewolf Omega, unstable transformation, possible breeding stock, the auctioneer announced when Arion's turn came. Bidding starts at 500. The words hit him like physical blows, reducing everything he had ever been to a few clinical descriptors. He was no longer Arion Greyfen, member of an ancient and respected family, gifted with intelligence and creativity and dreams for the future. He was just a commodity, valued only for the biological functions he could perform. The auction hall was filled with buyers whose interests ranged from the merely exploitative to the actively sadistic. Arion could smell their intentions through the haze of drugs that kept him docile. Some wanted laborers, others wanted entertainment. A few wanted things that he couldn't bear to contemplate. But it was the figure in the back corner who ultimately caught his attention, though he couldn't have said why. The being was tall and elegant, with the kind of otherworldly beauty that marked him as supernatural nobility. His skin had a pale, luminescent quality that suggested vampire heritage, but his presence was more subtle and controlled than the aggressive predators who made up most of the vampire attendees. When the bidding reached 2,000, most of the other buyers dropped out, apparently deciding that an unstable Omega werewolf wasn't worth the investment. But the mysterious figure in the corner raised his hand with casual authority. 5,000, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made it clear he was used to being obeyed without question. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with avarice. We have 5,000 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 6? Silence fell over the auction hall. 5,000 was an enormous sum for a damaged Omega, and none of the other buyers were willing to compete with someone who could afford to bid so casually. Sold to Lord Cale Valgaris for 5,000. The auctioneer announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. As Arian was dragged from the auction platform toward his new owner, he caught a glimpse of Lord Valgaris's face. The vampire was beautiful in the way that supernatural nobility often were, with aristocratic features and clothes that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. But there was something in his expression that Arian couldn't quite identify. Not the hunger or cruelty he had expected, but something that might have been compassion? The transaction was completed with efficient professionalism, money changing hands while Arian was transferred from the auction house's custody to that of his new owner. Lord Valgaris signed papers that made Arian his legal property, at least within the jurisdictions that recognized such arrangements. But when the vampire finally approached Arian's cage, his manner was completely different from what the Omega had expected. Instead of the casual cruelty that characterized interactions between owners and property, Lord Valgaris knelt down to bring himself to Arian's eye level. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, he said softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. You're hurt and afraid, and you have every right to be. But I promise you won't be harmed while you're under my protection. The words were so unexpected that Arian couldn't process them properly. Masters didn't promise protection to their property. They promised obedience, compliance, usefulness. But Lord Valgaris was speaking to him as if he were a person whose feelings mattered, whose welfare was important. Can you understand me? The vampire asked, apparently noticing Arian's confused expression. The drugs they use in these places can affect cognitive function. If you can't speak right now, that's all right. We'll work on that later. Arian tried to respond, to ask questions about his new situation, but his voice came out as nothing more than a broken whisper. The combination of trauma, drugs, and weeks of minimal food and water had left him barely capable of coherent communication. Lord Valgaris seemed to understand this, nodding with the kind of patience that suggested he had experience with helping damaged individuals recover from traumatic experiences. Rest now, he said gently, his hand hovering near the cage bars, as if he wanted to offer comfort, but wasn't sure whether physical contact would be welcome. When we get home, we'll start the process of healing. And I give you my word, you'll never be property again. As consciousness faded and Arian felt himself being transported toward an unknown future, he held onto those words like a lifeline. You'll never be property again. It was a promise that seemed too good to be true, but it was also the first sign of hope he had encountered since his exile began. Maybe his story wasn't over after all. Maybe this was just the beginning of something that could be better than anything he had lost. Chapter 3. The Court of Fire. Arian woke to warmth and softness that seemed impossible after weeks of deprivation and terror. The bed he lay in was enormous, with sheets that felt like silk against his skin and pillows that seemed to have been designed specifically for comfort rather than mere functionality. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across walls that were decorated with artwork he didn't recognize but found somehow soothing. For a moment, he wondered if he was dreaming, or if the trauma of his experiences had finally driven him to construct elaborate fantasies as an escape from unbearable reality. But the sensations were too detailed, too consistent, to be anything other than genuinely physical. A soft knock on the door interrupted his attempts to process his new circumstances. The figure who entered was clearly not human, though Arian couldn't immediately identify what species he might be. He was tall and elegant, with silver hair that seemed to catch light in impossible ways and eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom. Lord Kale asked me to check on you, the being said, his voice carrying cultured tones that spoke of centuries of service to supernatural nobility. I am Sylvain, steward of the Court of Fire. How are you feeling? Arian struggled to sit up, his body still weak from his ordeal but noticeably stronger than it had been in weeks. Someone had clearly been caring for him while he was unconscious. He was clean. His wounds had been tended, and he felt more rested than he had since his exile began. Where am I? He managed to ask, his voice still hoarse but functional. Lord Kale's estate in the Ashen Mountains, Sylvain replied. You've been recovering here for 3 days. The healer said you were suffering from severe malnutrition, exposure, and what she called spiritual trauma. She's been working to stabilize your condition. The casual mention of healers and spiritual trauma suggested that Lord Kale's household was both well-resourced and familiar with the kinds of damage that could be inflicted on supernatural beings. But Arian still couldn't understand why a vampire lord would invest such resources in a damaged Omega werewolf. What does he want from me? Arian asked, the question that had been nagging at him since the auction. That's for Lord Kale to explain, Sylvain said diplomatically. But I can tell you that you're safe here, and that you're free to move around the estate as you feel able. You're not a prisoner, whatever else you might be. After Sylvain left, Arian spent several hours exploring the suite of rooms that had apparently been designated as his quarters. The space was larger and more luxurious than anywhere he had lived even as a member of pack nobility, with a private bathroom that included a bathing pool large enough to swim in, a sitting area with comfortable chairs and good lighting for reading, and a wardrobe that had been stocked with clothes in his exact size. Most remarkably, the doors weren't locked. He could leave his quarters whenever he chose, explore the estate freely, even venture outside if he wanted to. It was a degree of freedom that seemed inconsistent with his status as property, and he couldn't understand what game Lord Kale might be playing. When he finally worked up the courage to venture beyond his rooms, Arian found himself in a mansion that was both grand and somehow welcoming. The architecture was clearly vampire in origin, with soaring ceilings and dramatic use of shadow and light, but it was also filled with evidence of life and activity, flowers in vases, books left open on tables, the sound of voices from other parts of the building. The estate's other residents were as diverse as any community Arian had ever encountered. There were vampires of various ages and ranks, but also fae, demons, and even a few werewolves who had apparently found sanctuary or employment in Lord Kale's service. What struck him most was how normal they all seemed, going about their daily activities with the kind of routine contentment that characterized any well-functioning household. You must be the new arrival, a voice said behind him as he stood in one of the estate's libraries, trying to understand what he was seeing. I'm Marcus, one of the household's researchers. I've been here about 10 years, ever since Lord Kale offered me a position after my own clan decided I was too interested in forbidden knowledge. Marcus was clearly a vampire, but young enough to retain much of his human appearance. His manner was friendly rather than predatory, and he seemed genuinely interested in welcoming Arian to the community. Position? Arian asked, confused by the terminology. Employment, Marcus clarified with a slight smile. Everyone here contributes to the household's operations in some way. I help maintain the magical archives and assist with research projects. Others work in the kitchens, the gardens, the workshops. Lord Kale believes in community rather than hierarchy. The concept was so foreign to Arian's experience that he struggled to process it. But I'm property. I was purchased at auction. Were you? Marcus asked, his expression becoming more serious. Or were you rescued from a situation that would have ended in exploitation or death? Lord Kale has a reputation for acquiring individuals who are in desperate circumstances, but what he does with them afterward is usually quite different from what the original transactions might suggest. Before Arian could ask for clarification, another voice joined the conversation from the library's entrance. Marcus is being diplomatic, the newcomer said, and Arian turned to see Lord Kale himself approaching with the kind of fluid grace that marked him as supernatural nobility. The truth is that I did purchase you, but only because it was the most efficient way to remove you from a situation that would have ended badly. Up close, Lord Kale was even more striking than Arian remembered from the auction. His pale skin had a subtle luminescence that suggested ancient vampire heritage, and his dark hair was shot through with silver that caught the light like precious metal. But it was his eyes that captured Arian's attention, deep amber, ancient and wise, but also kind in a way that seemed inconsistent with his reputation as a fearsome vampire lord. "What do you want from me?" Arian asked, the same question he had posed to Sylvain but directed now at the source. "Nothing that you're not willing to give," Lord Kale replied simply. "You're recovering from severe trauma, both physical and spiritual. My immediate goal is to help you heal, to give you the time and space you need to decide what you want to do with your life. And after that, the choice is yours," Lord Kale said. "You can stay here and find a role that suits your interests and abilities. You can leave and establish yourself elsewhere with whatever resources you need. You can pursue whatever path feels right to you, without coercion or manipulation from me or anyone else." The offer was so reasonable, so generous, that Arian found himself looking for the hidden catch. But Lord Kale's expression was open and sincere, and Marcus was nodding as if this kind of arrangement was perfectly normal. "Why me?" Arian asked. "Why spend so much on a damaged Omega werewolf when you could have acquired someone more useful?" Lord Kale was quiet for a moment, his ancient eyes distant with what might have been memory. "Because I know what it's like to be cast out by those who should have protected you," he said finally. "I know what it's like to be judged worthless because you don't fit into narrow categories of acceptability." The admission created an unexpected bridge between them, and Arian found himself looking at Lord Kale with new understanding. This wasn't just charity or casual kindness, it was recognition of shared experience, empathy born from personal knowledge of loss and rejection. "What happened to you?" Arian asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. But Lord Kale didn't seem offended. If anything, his expression became more open, more genuine. "I refused to participate in the massacre of a human settlement that had committed no crime beyond existing in territory my clan wanted to claim," he said. "I was cast out from the vampire courts for showing mercy to beings they considered beneath notice." The parallel to Arian's own situation was striking, though the circumstances were completely different. Both of them had been rejected by their birth communities for failing to conform to expected behaviors, for choosing compassion over cruelty or tradition. "I've been building something different here," Lord Kale continued. "A community where beings can be valued for who they are rather than what they represent, where diversity is seen as strength rather than weakness, where individuals can grow and change without fear of judgment or punishment." As if to illustrate his point, a small figure appeared in the library doorway, a child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with features that suggested mixed heritage and eyes that held far too much wisdom for someone so young. "Kale," the child said, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about the formal titles that most beings used when addressing vampire lords. "Sylvain says dinner will be ready in an hour, and he wants to know if our guest will be joining us." "That depends on whether our guest feels ready for company," Lord Kale replied, his manner with the child warm and paternal rather than authoritative. "Arian, this is Lysander. He's been part of our household for about 2 years." The child studied Arian with the kind of direct curiosity that only children could manage. "Are you going to stay with us?" he asked. "Kale says you might if you want to." "I don't know yet," Arian replied honestly. "I'm still trying to understand what this place is, what kind of community you've built here." "It's home," Lysander said with simple certainty. "We take care of each other, and nobody gets abandoned or cast out just for being different. Want to see my room? I have books about dragons." The innocent invitation, offered without any agenda beyond friendship, was somehow more persuasive than any elaborate argument could have been. This was a place where a child felt safe enough to invite strangers to see his treasures, where the most powerful resident was addressed by his first name, where community was built on care rather than dominance. "I'd like that," Arian said, and felt the first genuine smile he had experienced since his exile beginning to form on his face. As Lysander led him away to share his collection of dragon books, Arian caught Lord Kale watching them with an expression of quiet satisfaction. This was what the vampire lord had been trying to show him, not through arguments or explanations, but through simple demonstration of what was possible when beings chose to create family based on love rather than obligation. For the first time since his rejection, Arian began to believe that maybe his story wasn't over after all. Maybe this was just the beginning of something that could be better than anything he had lost. Chapter 4. The Slow Bloom of Trust. The weeks that followed established a routine unlike anything Arian had experienced in his previous life. He woke each morning in his comfortable suite, joined the household for breakfast in a dining room that buzzed with conversation and laughter, then spent his days exploring the estate and learning about the various projects that kept its residents occupied. Lord Kale, who had asked to be called simply Kale during their third conversation, proved to be everything he had claimed and more. He never issued commands or demanded obedience, instead offering suggestions and invitations that Arian was free to accept or decline. When Arian showed interest in the estate's extensive library, Kale arranged for him to work with Marcus on cataloging and preservation projects. When he expressed curiosity about the gardens, Sylvain introduced him to the botanical specialists who maintained the estate's impressive collection of rare plants. Most importantly, Kale never pressured him for explanations about his past or expectations about his future. He seemed content to let Arian heal at his own pace, offering support and friendship without demanding anything in return. But it was during their evening conversations that Arian began to understand the depth of Kale's character and the reasons behind his exile from vampire society. They would sit together in Kale's private study, a fire crackling in the hearth while they discussed everything from philosophical questions about the nature of justice to practical observations about estate management. I was raised to believe that strength meant the willingness to destroy anything that threatened vampire interests, Kale said one evening, his voice distant with memory. Mercy was seen as weakness, compassion as corruption. The massacre I refused to participate in was just one of many such incidents. Humans who had the misfortune of occupying territory we wanted, who were deemed expendable because they couldn't defend themselves. What changed your mind? Arian asked, genuinely curious about the transformation that had led to Kale's exile. I spent time among the humans, Kale replied, not as a predator hunting prey, but as someone trying to understand them as individuals. I saw their capacity for love, creativity, sacrifice for others' welfare. I realized that they were people, not resources, and that destroying them to benefit my clan was fundamentally wrong. The admission revealed depths of character that Arian hadn't expected from a vampire lord, even one who had been cast out for his merciful tendencies. But it also explained the compassion that had led Kale to rescue him from the auction house, the patience with which he was approaching Arian's healing, the community he had built from other outcasts and refugees. Do you regret it? Arian asked, choosing conscience over clan loyalty? I regret the loneliness, Kale said honestly. I regret losing connection with my birth family, losing my place in the social structures that had defined my identity for centuries. But I don't regret saving those lives, and I don't regret building something here that operates on principles I can actually be proud of. It was during these conversations that Arian began to realize his feelings for Kale were evolving beyond simple gratitude and respect. The vampire lord was beautiful in the way that supernatural nobility often were, but it was his kindness and wisdom that truly made him compelling. When he spoke about his principles, his eyes would light up with passion that transformed his aristocratic features into something almost radiant. When he listened to Arian's own thoughts and experiences, he gave his complete attention as if nothing else in the world mattered. These developing feelings were both thrilling and terrifying. Arian had been rejected once by someone he had believed was his destined mate, and the trauma of that experience made him wary of opening his heart again. What if his attraction to Kale was just gratitude confused with romantic feelings? What if he was simply transferring his need for acceptance onto the first person who had shown him kindness? Worse, what if Kale's interest in him was purely charitable, the way a caring person might feel protective of an injured animal? The vampire lord had made it clear that Arian was free to leave whenever he chose, that there were no expectations or obligations attached to his residence at the estate. But he had never suggested that their relationship might develop into something deeper than friendship. These anxieties were complicating Arian's daily life when an unexpected crisis forced him to confront both his feelings and his own hidden strengths. It began with Lysander's screams echoing through the estate in the middle of the night, sounds of terror that brought everyone running to investigate. They found the child in his room, thrashing in his bed as if fighting invisible attackers, his young face contorted with pain and fear. But there were no physical injuries, no signs of intrusion or violence. Whatever was happening to Lysander was occurring on a level that went beyond normal perception. Nightmare curse, Marcus said grimly, his extensive knowledge of supernatural afflictions making him the first to recognize the symptoms. Someone has targeted him with dream magic designed to trap the victim in escalating cycles of terror. Kale's expression darkened with protective fury. Who would curse a child? What possible threat could Lysander represent to anyone? It's not about Lysander specifically, Sylvain said, his ancient wisdom allowing him to see patterns that others missed. It's about sending a message to you. Someone wants to demonstrate that they can reach into your household and hurt those you care about. The implications were staggering. The estate's magical defenses were extensive and sophisticated, designed to prevent exactly this kind of attack. For someone to breach them and target a child suggested enemies with significant resources and detailed knowledge of the household's vulnerabilities. Can it be broken? Arian asked, his heart breaking as he watched Lysander suffer. Dream magic is notoriously difficult to counter, Marcus replied. It requires someone with the ability to enter the victim's subconscious, to confront whatever nightmare scenario has been constructed, and to provide enough psychological support to break the cycle. I'll do it, Kale said immediately, but Marcus shook his head. Vampire minds don't work the same way as mortal consciousness, he explained. Your mental processes are too different from Lysander's for successful dreamwalking. We need someone whose psychological patterns are closer to his own. It was then that Arian understood what was being asked of him. Lysander was young, vulnerable, abandoned by his original family, and dependent on this household for his security and sense of belonging. The parallels to Arian's own situation were clear, and those parallels might be the key to successful intervention. I'll do it, Arian said, his voice steadier than he felt. I know what it's like to be afraid and alone. Maybe that knowledge can help me reach him. The process of entering another person's dreams was dangerous and complex, requiring magical techniques that Arian had never attempted before. But the estate's healers were experienced with such procedures, and they guided him through the preparation with careful attention to safety protocols. As consciousness faded and Arian felt himself being drawn into Lysander's subconscious, he held onto the memory of every kindness he had received since arriving at the estate. Kale's patient understanding, Sylvain's gentle care, Marcus's friendship, and most of all, Lysander's own innocent trust in the possibility of belonging. The nightmare realm he found himself in was a twisted version of the child's memories, filled with the monsters that had haunted his early life before he found sanctuary at the estate. But instead of facing them alone, Lysander now had someone who understood his fear, who could stand beside him and prove that the monsters were not as powerful as they seemed. You're not alone, Arian told the dream version of Lysander, his voice carrying all the conviction of someone who had found his own way out of darkness. And you're not helpless. We're going to fight this together. The battle that followed was conducted with weapons of hope and determination rather than violence, proving to both the dreamer and the nightmare that love was stronger than fear, that belonging was more powerful than abandonment, that chosen family could overcome any trauma. When Arian finally woke from the dreamwalking, he found himself surrounded by anxious faces and gentle hands helping him sit up. But it was Lysander's bright smile that told him the intervention had been successful. Thank you, the child said, his voice still hoarse from his ordeal but clear and strong. You saved me. We saved each other, Arian replied, realizing that the experience had changed him as much as it had helped Lysander. For the first time since his exile, he had been able to use his own pain as a source of strength rather than weakness, to help someone else rather than simply surviving his own trauma. It was Kale who helped him to his feet, the vampire lord's hands warm and steady as he supported Arian's weight. But it was the expression in Kale's eyes that truly took Arian's breath away. Not just gratitude or admiration, but something deeper and more personal. You were extraordinary, Kale said softly, his voice carrying emotions that went far beyond simple appreciation. Your courage, your compassion, your willingness to risk yourself for someone you care about. It was beautiful to witness. The praise sent warmth flooding through Arian's chest, but it was the underlying implication that made his heart skip a beat. Kale wasn't just commenting on his actions. He was seeing him, really seeing him, as someone worthy of love and respect. I couldn't have done it without knowing I had somewhere safe to return to, Arian replied, meeting Kale's gaze directly. Without knowing that there were people here who cared about both of us. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities and the growing recognition that their relationship was evolving into something neither of them had expected but both were beginning to hope for. As the household gradually returned to normal after the crisis, Arian found himself no longer questioning whether his feelings for Kale were real or simply confused gratitude. The connection between them was genuine, built on shared experiences and mutual respect, deepened by the gradual revelation of each other's true character. But with that recognition came new questions about the future. What kind of relationship was possible between a vampire lord and an exiled Omega werewolf? How could they navigate the vast differences in their power, their social status, their very species? And most importantly, did Kale's growing affection for him represent the possibility of genuine love? Or was Arian simply projecting his own hopes onto kindness that was meant to remain platonic? Only time would tell, but for the first time since his rejection, Arian felt brave enough to hope that love might be possible for him after all. Chapter 5. The Heart Learns to Trust. The days following the Nightmare Curse incident brought subtle but significant changes to the dynamic between Arian and Kale. Where their interactions had previously been marked by careful courtesy and gradually developing friendship, now there was an undercurrent of something deeper, looks that lingered a moment longer than necessary, conversations that seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning, casual touches that sent warmth spreading through both their bodies. Arian found himself paying attention to details about Kale that had nothing to do with their growing friendship. The way the vampire lord's eyes would light up when he was discussing something that genuinely excited him. The elegant precision of his movements, as if he was always conscious of his supernatural strength and determined never to use it carelessly. The rare, brilliant smile that transformed his aristocratic features into something almost breathtakingly beautiful. Most importantly, he began to notice the way Kale looked at him. Not with the casual kindness he showed to all the estate's residents, but with something more personal and intimate. When Arian was working in the library, he would sometimes catch Kale watching him with an expression of quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone like Arian was real. When they walked together through the estate's gardens, Kale would unconsciously adjust his pace to match Arian's, creating a natural harmony that spoke of deep compatibility. But it was during their evening conversations that the growing attraction between them became most obvious. They would sit together in Kale's private study, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, while they discussed everything from philosophical questions about the nature of loyalty to personal reflections on their respective journeys through exile and recovery. "I've been thinking about what you said," Arian said one evening, "about choosing conscience over clan loyalty, about building something new rather than just surviving rejection." "Oh!" Kale's attention focused on him with the kind of intensity that always made Arian feel like he was the most important person in the world. "I used to think that being rejected by my fated mate meant I was fundamentally flawed," Arian continued, his voice growing stronger as he articulated thoughts that had been developing over weeks of healing and reflection. "That there was something wrong with me that even divine intervention couldn't overcome. And now I think maybe the bond system itself is flawed," Arian said, the words coming out in a rush as if he was afraid he might lose his courage if he paused. "Maybe the idea that werewolves can only find happiness with their mystically determined mates is just another form of control. Another way of limiting our choices and keeping us trapped in patterns that don't actually serve our best interests." Kale's expression grew thoughtful, and Arian could see him processing the implications of what was being suggested. "That's a remarkably revolutionary perspective," he said finally. "Most werewolves would consider it heretical to question the sacred nature of fated bonds." "Most werewolves haven't experienced what I have," Arian replied, They haven't had the chance to discover what it feels like to be valued for who they are rather than what mystical forces decree they should be. They haven't learned that love based on choice and compatibility can be stronger than love based on supernatural compulsion. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them could ignore. Arian was essentially saying that what he felt for Kale, the attraction, the deep emotional connection, the growing certainty that they belonged together, was more real and more valuable than the fated bond that had been destroyed by Taryn's rejection. Arian, Kale said softly, his voice carrying caution mixed with what might have been hope. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Instead of answering directly, Arian stood up from his chair and moved to stand in front of Kale, his heart pounding with the audacity of what he was about to do. I'm saying that I've found something here that I never had with my fated mate. Understanding, respect, the feeling of being truly seen and valued. I'm saying that what I feel for you has nothing to do with mystical compulsion and everything to do with genuine affection. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage for the most important words he had ever spoken. I'm saying that I love you, Kale, not because fate decreed it, not because I'm grateful for your kindness, but because you're extraordinary and I can't imagine my life without you in it. For a moment, Kale seemed frozen, his ancient eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like wonder. Then he was rising from his chair, moving to stand directly in front of Arian, his hands hovering near the Omega's face as if he wanted to touch but wasn't sure whether it would be welcome. I love you too, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I have since the moment I saw you in that auction house. Broken and afraid but still somehow magnificent. I love your courage, your compassion, your willingness to grow beyond the limitations that others tried to impose on you. The confession sent joy flooding through Arian's entire being. But it was Kale's next words that truly took his breath away. But I need you to understand that this changes everything, Kale continued, his hands finally coming to rest on Arian's cheeks with infinite gentleness. If we pursue this, if we become partners in truth rather than just friends, you'll no longer be my rescued refugee or my household guest. You'll be my equal, my beloved, someone whose happiness and safety are as important to me as my own. Is that what you want? Arian asked, his voice trembling with the magnitude of what was being offered. More than I've ever wanted anything, Kale replied, and then he was leaning down to kiss Arian with the kind of reverent tenderness that made it clear this was the beginning of something sacred. The kiss was everything Arian had dreamed of and nothing like what he had experienced with Taryn during their brief, failed courtship. Where his fated mate had been demanding and possessive, Kale was gentle and giving, focusing on Arian's comfort and pleasure rather than his own needs. Where Taryn had made him feel small and inadequate, Kale made him feel cherished and valued, as if he was something precious that deserved to be protected and adored. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Arian could see his own wonder and joy reflected in Kale's amber eyes. Are you certain about this? Kale asked, his voice husky with emotion. I'm not werewolf. I'm not your fated mate. I'm not anything that your people would consider appropriate for an Omega. Are you sure you're ready for the complications that a relationship with me would bring? I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Arian replied without hesitation. I don't want appropriate or traditional or what my people would approve of. I want you exactly as you are, for as long as you'll have me. What followed was the most beautiful courtship Arian could have imagined, built on the foundation of genuine friendship they had already established but elevated by the recognition of their mutual love. Kale pursued him with the patient intensity of someone who had learned that the best things in life were worth waiting for, creating moments of romance and intimacy that were perfectly tailored to Arian's needs and desires. There were private dinners in the estate's most beautiful locations, where they could talk for hours without interruption. There were long walks through the gardens, where Kale would point out rare flowers and explain their magical properties while Arian shared stories from his childhood and his dreams for the future. There were quiet evenings spent reading together, simply enjoying each other's presence while pursuing their individual interests. But perhaps most importantly, there were conversations about their hopes and fears, their past traumas and their healing journeys, the complex process of learning to trust again after being hurt by those who should have protected them. I'm afraid sometimes, Arian admitted one evening as they sat together on a balcony overlooking the estate's main courtyard. Afraid that this is too good to be true, that I'll wake up one day and discover it was all a dream or a delusion brought on by trauma. I have the same fear, Kale replied, reaching over to take Arian's hand in his own. I'm afraid that you'll realize you deserve someone better than an exiled vampire lord with a questionable past and enemies who won't hesitate to target those I care about. Then we'll have to keep proving to each other that this is real, Arian said, intertwining their fingers and marveling at how perfectly they fit together. Every day, in every way we can, we'll choose each other and build something strong enough to survive whatever challenges we face. Their physical relationship developed with the same careful consideration that characterized every other aspect of their courtship. Kale never pushed for more intimacy than Arian was ready to offer, never used his superior strength or supernatural nature to pressure for compliance with his desires. Instead, he let Arian set the pace, responding to his advances with enthusiasm while always checking to make sure his partner was comfortable and enthusiastic about each new development. When they finally came together completely, it was in the context of absolute trust and mutual desire, a joining that was as much spiritual as physical. Kale made love to him with the kind of reverent attention that made Arian feel worshipped rather than merely desired, focusing on his pleasure and emotional needs in ways that transformed the act from simple physical gratification into something transcendent. I love you, Kale whispered afterward as they lay entwined in the soft light of dawn filtering through the bedroom windows. Thank you for trusting me with your heart, for letting me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself, Arian replied, the words carrying all the weight of his journey from broken exile to beloved partner. Thank you for showing me what love can be when it's based on choice rather than compulsion. As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, Arian reflected on how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a rejected Omega with no future and no hope, dying slowly in the borderlands between packed territories. Now he was loved, valued, and building a partnership with someone who treated him as an equal rather than a possession. But their happiness was about to be tested by forces from Arian's past, and he would soon discover that love, no matter how strong, sometimes had to be defended against those who couldn't understand its value. The storm that was coming would challenge everything they had built together, but it would also prove that some bonds were strong enough to survive any trial, especially when they were chosen freely rather than imposed by fate. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Addition. It was during one of Arian's morning walks through the estate's extensive grounds that he first encountered the child who would change everything. He had been exploring a section of the property he hadn't visited before, following a path that wound through ancient trees and over a small stream, when he heard the sound of quiet crying coming from a thicket of bushes. His werewolf senses immediately went on alert, detecting the scent of distress and something else, something that made his protective instincts surge to the surface. Moving carefully through the underbrush, he found a small figure huddled against the base of a large oak tree, his thin frame shaking with exhaustion and fear. The child couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with dark hair that was matted with dirt and clothes that were little more than rags. But it was his eyes that caught Arian's attention. They held flecks of gold that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light, and there was something about his scent that suggested he was more than simply human. "Hello," Arian said softly, approaching slowly with his hands visible and empty. "Are you hurt?" The child looked up with the kind of wariness that came from experiencing too much cruelty at too young an age. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent Arian didn't recognize, along with a quality that seemed to resonate on frequencies beyond normal hearing. "Please don't hurt me," the boy whispered, pressing himself further against the tree trunk. "I didn't mean to trespass. I was just so tired, and the trees here felt safe." "I'm not going to hurt you," Arian assured him, kneeling down to bring himself to the child's eye level. "My name is Arian. What's yours?" The boy hesitated for a long moment, clearly torn between desperate hope and learned caution. "Davin," he said finally. "I don't have a family name anymore. They said I couldn't keep it after what I am became obvious." The words were heartbreakingly familiar to Arian, who had heard similar stories from other residents of Kale's estate. Another child cast out by those who should have protected him, abandoned for the crime of being different. "What are you?" Arian asked gently, though he was already beginning to suspect the answer. "Dragon-blooded?" Davin said, his voice carrying shame and fear. "My father was human, but my mother was a dragon who took human form. When my abilities started manifesting, the human community decided I was too dangerous to keep around. Dragon-blooded children were incredibly rare and usually powerful beyond their ability to control. Most were taken in by dragon communities when their heritage became apparent, but some fell through the cracks, abandoned by their human families but unable to find their way to their draconic relatives. "How long have you been on your own?" Arian asked, his heart breaking for the child's obvious suffering. 3 months, Davin replied. "Maybe longer. I've been trying to find other dragons, but I don't know how. Sometimes I can almost hear them calling to me, but I can't figure out how to answer." The loneliness in his voice was devastating, and Arian felt a fierce surge of protective anger toward the adults who had abandoned a child to face such dangers alone. But anger wouldn't help Davin now, only practical action could do that. "Would you like to come home with me?" Arian asked, making the offer without even thinking about it. "I live at an estate where there are lots of different kinds of people, and we specialize in helping those who don't fit into traditional categories." "Really?" Davin's eyes lit up with hope that was almost painful to witness. "I could stay? Even though I'm dragon-blooded?" "Especially because you're dragon-blooded," Arian replied firmly. "Being different isn't a flaw. It's what makes you special." The journey back to the main estate gave Arian time to think about what he was doing. He had just invited a dragon-blooded child to live with them without consulting Kale or anyone else, making decisions about the household's composition based on nothing more than his own protective instincts. But as he looked at Davin walking beside him, his small hand trustingly placed in Arian's larger one, he knew he had made the right choice. Kale's reaction to their unexpected guest was everything Arian had hoped for and more. The vampire lord took one look at the exhausted, frightened child and immediately shifted into protective mode, his demeanor becoming warm and welcoming in a way that made Davin's tense shoulders relax for the first time since Arian had found him. "Welcome to our home," Kale said, kneeling down to Davin's eye level with the same careful courtesy he showed to adult visitors. "I'm Kale, and I'm very glad Arian found you. Are you hungry? Sylvain makes excellent hot chocolate, and I think we have some cookies that might interest you." The casual offer of food and comfort, delivered without any demands or expectations, seemed to break down the last of Davin's defenses. He nodded eagerly, his young face lighting up with the first genuine smile Arian had seen from him. As they settled Davin in the estate's main dining room with a substantial meal and the promise of a warm bath and clean clothes, Arian found himself marveling at how naturally Kale had accepted the addition to their household. There had been no questions about resources or complications, no hesitation about taking on the responsibility of caring for a child with potentially dangerous supernatural abilities. "Thank you," Arian said quietly as they watched Davin systematically work his way through a plate of food that was probably more than he had eaten in days. "For what?" Kale asked, genuinely puzzled. "For not questioning my decision to bring him home," Arian replied. "For accepting him without hesitation. For making him feel welcome and safe." Kale's expression grew soft with understanding. "Did you think I would do anything else? He's a child who needs protection and care. Of course he's welcome here." It was exactly the response Arian had hoped for, but it still filled him with warmth to see his partner's compassionate nature in action. This was why he had fallen in love with Kale, not just for his strength or his beauty, but for his fundamental decency and his commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The process of integrating Davin into their household proved to be both challenging and deeply rewarding. The child's dragon heritage manifested in ways that were both fascinating and sometimes alarming. He could sense emotional atmospheres with uncanny accuracy. His body temperature ran significantly higher than normal, and when he was upset or excited, small flames would dance around his fingertips. But perhaps most remarkably, he had an instinctive understanding of social dynamics that belied his young age. Within days of his arrival, He had identified the key relationships within the household and was working to strengthen them rather than disrupt them. Arian loves you very much, he told Kale one evening as the three of them sat together in the estate's main living room. I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way his whole body relaxes when you're in the room. You make him feel safe. I hope so, Kale replied, glancing at Arian with an expression of such tenderness that it made Arian's heart skip a beat. Making him feel safe and loved is one of my most important responsibilities. And you love him too, Davin continued with the matter-of-fact directness that only children could manage. Different from how you care about the rest of us, but just as real. Dragon-blooded can sense these things, you know. Love has a particular resonance that's hard to mistake. The casual confirmation of what they all already knew somehow made their family bond feel more official, more real. They weren't just a vampire lord and his rescued Omega werewolf and the child they had taken in. They were a family, chosen and created through love rather than birth or obligation. As the weeks passed, Arian found himself taking on more and more parental responsibilities with Davin, and discovering that he had a natural aptitude for nurturing that he had never known he possessed. The child's presence awakened protective instincts that went beyond anything he had experienced before, a fierce determination to ensure that Davin never suffered the kind of abandonment and rejection that had marked both his and Arian's early lives. You're good at this, Kale observed one evening as they watched Davin practice his flame control exercises in the estate's protected training area. Being a father, you have instincts for it that I didn't expect. Neither did I, Arian admitted, feeling a flush of pride at the compliment. I always assumed that Omega werewolves were only suited for traditional nuclear families, that our nurturing abilities were tied to bearing and raising our own biological children. And now I think maybe the capacity for love and protection isn't limited by biology or conventional family structures, Arian replied, watching as Davin successfully created a small but perfectly controlled flame that danced in his palm. Maybe family is about choosing to care for each other, regardless of genetics or species or any other arbitrary category. It was a philosophy that their household had been demonstrating for months, but Davin's presence made it feel more significant somehow. They were proving that love could transcend every boundary that traditional society tried to impose: species, social class, blood relationships, even the supposed sacred nature of fated bonds. But their happiness was about to be tested by forces that viewed their unconventional family as a threat to the established order. The storm that was coming would challenge everything they had built together, and prove whether their chosen bonds were strong enough to survive the opposition of those who couldn't understand or accept what they represented. As autumn turned to winter and their family settled into comfortable routines, none of them could have predicted that their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by the arrival of representatives from Arian's past beings who saw his transformation from rejected Omega to beloved partner and father as an affront to everything they held sacred. The battle for their right to exist as a family was about to begin, and it would test every bond they had formed, every lesson they had learned about the true nature of love and loyalty. Chapter 7. The storm breaks. The attack came at dawn on the winter solstice, when the estate's magical defenses were undergoing their seasonal recalibration and the household was at its most vulnerable. Arian woke to the sound of Davin's terrified cries echoing through the corridors, the child's dragon abilities responding to his fear by setting small fires throughout his room. Through the windows of their bedroom, Arian could see the source of the disturbance. A massive force of werewolf warriors had surrounded the estate, their numbers far exceeding anything a single pack could field. This was a coalition, multiple packs working together in coordination that spoke of careful planning and significant resources. At the head of the assembled force, mounted on a magnificent black horse and wearing ceremonial armor that marked him as a pack leader, was Terran Wilmorn. The alpha who had once been Arian's fated mate had apparently assumed leadership of the Silver Blood Pack, and he had brought what looked like half the werewolf population of the kingdom to reclaim what he considered his property. How many? Kale asked, pulling on clothes and weapons with the efficiency of someone who had faced such threats before. At least 500 warriors, Arian replied, his enhanced senses picking up the scope of the forces arrayed against them. Multiple packs all working together. They're not here to negotiate. They're here to destroy everything we've built. The irony wasn't lost on him that Terran, who had once rejected him as worthless and weak, was now leading an army to reclaim him. But this wasn't about genuine regret or romantic love. It was about dominance and control, about the Alpha's inability to accept that his former property had found happiness without him. Kale's response was swift and decisive, drawing on centuries of experience with supernatural warfare. The estate's residents were organized into defensive positions that took advantage of both their diverse abilities and the natural fortifications of the mountain location. But it quickly became clear that they were massively outnumbered and outgunned. "They're not just werewolves," Marcus reported after a scouting mission to assess the enemy forces. "There are human mercenaries with supernatural-specific weapons, and I spotted at least 3 vampire warbands that seemed to be working as allies rather than enemies." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about pack politics or territorial disputes. It was a coordinated effort by multiple supernatural factions to eliminate what they saw as a threat to the established order. "Why are they working together?" Arian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because what we represent threatens all of them," Kale replied grimly. "We've proven that love can transcend species boundaries, that family can be created through choice rather than birth, that individuals can thrive outside the traditional power structures that keep them in line." The first assault came as the sun reached its zenith, waves of werewolf warriors attempting to breach the estate's outer defenses, while human mercenaries provided cover fire with weapons designed to disrupt supernatural abilities. The fighting was fierce and desperate, with the estate's defenders using every advantage they could find to hold off forces that outnumbered them 10-1. But it was the psychological warfare that proved most effective. As the battle raged, Terran's voice could be heard across the estate, amplified by magical means to ensure that his words reached every defender. "Arian Grayfen," the Alpha called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You were cast out for your weakness and inadequacy, but I am prepared to offer you redemption. Surrender yourself and the abomination you've been harboring, and I will allow the others to live." The reference to Davin as an abomination sent fury racing through Arian's veins, but it was the casual assumption that he would abandon his family to save himself that truly enraged him. "Go to hell," Arian shouted back, his voice carrying across the battlefield with power he didn't know he possessed. "I'll never surrender to you, and I'll never let you harm my family." The defiant response seemed to surprise Terran, as if he had genuinely expected Arian to capitulate when faced with overwhelming force. But it also triggered an escalation in the attack, with more forces being committed to breaching the estate's defenses. It was during the third wave of assault that disaster struck. A group of human mercenaries managed to breach the estate's inner perimeter, making their way toward the residential sections where Davin had been sheltering with Sylvain and the other non-combatants. The child's terrified cries echoed through the corridors as dragon fire began to manifest uncontrollably around him. Arian didn't hesitate. Abandoning his defensive position, he ran toward the sound of Davin's distress, his protective instincts overriding every tactical consideration. He found the child surrounded by flames in the estate's main library, his young face streaked with tears as he struggled to control abilities that were responding to his terror. "It's all right," Arian said, moving carefully through the fire to reach Davin's side. "I'm here. You're safe now." But they weren't safe, and they both knew it. The mercenaries were closing in, and Arian's presence had only made them both targets for capture rather than just Davin. That was when Kale arrived, his vampire nature fully manifest as he moved through the enemies with lethal efficiency. But there were too many of them, and even his supernatural abilities couldn't eliminate all the threats before one of them managed to land a blow that sent him crashing into the library's stone wall. "Kale!" Arian's cry of anguish carried such power that it shattered every window in the library, the sound resonating on frequencies that made even the supernatural mercenaries stagger. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. Power flowed through Arian like liquid fire, abilities he had never known he possessed suddenly blazing to life. His voice carried harmonics that made reality itself seem to bend and shift around him, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Enough," he commanded. and somehow the single word was enough to freeze every combatant in place. This ends now. The power that had awakened in him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the simple physical strength of werewolf transformation, but something that seemed to touch the very foundations of supernatural existence. When he looked at the assembled enemies, he could see their deepest fears and insecurities, their hidden doubts about the righteousness of their cause. "You came here to destroy a family," Arian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the estate and beyond. "To murder a child whose only crime is being different. To punish love that doesn't conform to your narrow definitions of acceptability." As he spoke, the power flowing through him intensified, and he began to project his experiences directly into the minds of everyone present, attackers and defenders alike. They felt his rejection and exile, his slow healing under Kale's care, his growing love for the vampire lord who had seen his worth when no one else would. They experienced his joy at finding Davin, his fierce protectiveness for the child who had been abandoned just as he had been. Most importantly, they felt the deep satisfaction and fulfillment that came from being part of a family built on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty, acceptance rather than conformity. The effect on the attacking forces was immediate and devastating. Many of the werewolf warriors lowered their weapons, their expressions shifting from aggressive certainty to confused uncertainty. The human mercenaries found themselves questioning why they were fighting on behalf of causes they didn't understand against people who had never harmed them. But it was Terran's reaction that was most significant. The alpha leader stood frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and growing realization as he experienced firsthand what Arian had become. Not the weak, frightened Omega he had rejected, but someone who had found strength in love, purpose in protection, and power in choosing to build rather than destroy. "This is impossible," Terran whispered, his voice barely audible across the now silent battlefield. "Omegas don't have this kind of ability. You're supposed to be weak, submissive, dependent on alpha protection." "I was never weak," Arian replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I was just taught to believe I was weak, trained to accept limitations that were imposed on me rather than inherent in my nature. You rejected me because you were afraid of what I might become if I was allowed to grow beyond your narrow expectations." The truth of his words resonated through the assembled forces, and Arian could see understanding beginning to dawn in faces that had been set in lines of righteous certainty just moments before. "You see what I built after you cast me out," Arian continued, gesturing toward Kale and Davin, who had moved to stand beside him in a display of family unity. "A partnership based on equality rather than dominance. A child who is loved for who he is rather than punished for what he represents. A community where beings can thrive regardless of species or social status or any other arbitrary category." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before delivering the final blow to their justifications for this attack. "And you came here to destroy it," he said, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "Not because it was evil or dangerous, but because it proved that your way of doing things isn't the only way. Because it demonstrated that love can be stronger than fear, that choice can be more powerful than compulsion, that family can be created rather than just inherited." The silence that followed was profound, charged with the recognition that everything they had believed about natural law and proper relationships had been challenged by undeniable evidence to the contrary. It was one of the younger werewolf warriors who spoke first, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally shaken. "If this is possible," he said, "if love can transcend species boundaries, if family can be chosen rather than assigned, then why are we fighting to prevent it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the attacking forces represented, and Arian could see the coalition beginning to fracture as individual warriors began to question their participation in this assault. But Terran wasn't ready to accept defeat or transformation. With a roar of rage that carried all his frustrated pride and wounded ego, he launched himself at Arian, his partially transformed claws extended toward the Omega's throat. The attack never landed. Kale intercepted the Alpha's charge with vampire speed, his own supernatural strength proving more than a match for Terran's werewolf abilities. But it was Davin who ended the confrontation, the child's dragon fire blazing around him as he stepped forward to protect the family that had given him everything he had never dared to hope for. "Don't hurt my fathers," Davin said, his young voice carrying harmonics that made it clear he was far more powerful than his age would suggest. "They saved me, they loved me, they made me feel like I belonged somewhere. I won't let you take that away." The sight of a child willing to fight to protect his chosen family was more persuasive than any argument could have been. One by one, the attacking forces began to lay down their weapons, their aggression dissolving in the face of evidence that what they had come to destroy was beautiful rather than corrupted. As the sun set on what had been intended as a day of destruction, Arian found himself surrounded by enemies who were becoming something else entirely, beings who were beginning to understand that love could indeed transcend every boundary that tradition tried to impose, and that some things were worth fighting to protect rather than fighting to destroy. The real victory wasn't military. It was the transformation of hearts and minds, the slow recognition that the family they had built was exactly what the world needed more of, not less. Chapter 8. The Choice of Love. The aftermath of the battle brought unexpected developments that none of them could have predicted. Instead of retreating in defeat, many of the attacking forces remained at the estate, their leaders requesting permission to establish a temporary camp while they processed what they had experienced during Arian's display of power. The psychological impact of feeling genuine love and acceptance from the inside had been profound, forcing beings who had lived their entire lives within rigid social structures to confront the possibility that alternatives might exist. More importantly, it had shown them what they had been missing: the deep satisfaction that came from being valued for who they truly were rather than what roles they were expected to play. "We need to talk," Terran said, approaching Arian 3 days after the failed assault. The Alpha looked haggard, his usual arrogant confidence replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or even humility. They met in the estate's main garden, a neutral space where they could speak privately without the complications of household politics or territorial considerations. Kale and Davin remained nearby but not close enough to interfere, their presence a reminder of what Arian had built after his rejection. "I owe you an apology," Terran began, the words clearly difficult for someone who had spent his entire life believing he was never wrong. "Not just for the attack, but for everything. For rejecting our bond, for casting you out, for spending years believing that you were the problem rather than recognizing that I was the one who failed." The admission was more than Arian had ever expected to hear, but it also came too late to change anything fundamental about their relationship. "I appreciate the apology," Arian replied carefully, "but you need to understand that I'm not the same person you rejected. I've grown. I've healed. I've found love and purpose in ways that I never could have imagined when I was focused on our fated bond." "I can see that," Terran said, his eyes tracking to where Kale was working with Davin on flame control exercises. "What you've built here, the family you've created, the power you've developed, it's extraordinary. It's everything I was too afraid to let you become." "Then why did you come here with an army?" Arian asked. "Why try to destroy what you now claim to admire?" Terran was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant with what might have been painful self-reflection. "Because seeing you thrive without me was more threatening to my ego than seeing you broken because of me," he said finally. "Because accepting that you had found something better than what I offered meant acknowledging that I had made the wrong choice." The honesty was startling, but it also highlighted the fundamental difference between Terran's approach to relationships and what Arian had found with Kale. Where Terran saw love as possession and control, Kale saw it as liberation and growth. "What do you want from me now?" Arian asked. "Nothing," Terran replied, and the word carried surprising weight. "I want nothing from you except the chance to learn from what you've accomplished, to understand how to build something similar in my own territory, how to create space for beings who don't fit into traditional categories." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Arian had expected. Terran asked detailed questions about how their household functioned, how they had integrated beings from different species, how they handled conflicts and made decisions. But more importantly, he listened to the answers with the kind of attention that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply gathering information. "The key," Arian explained, "is to start with the assumption that everyone deserves respect and acceptance regardless of their background or abilities. When you create an environment where beings feel safe to be themselves, they contribute more than you ever could have imagined. And when conflicts arise, we talk about them, Arian said simply. We listen to each other's perspectives. We look for solutions that work for everyone involved. We prioritize the well-being of the community over individual egos or traditional power structures. It was a philosophy that ran counter to everything Terran had been taught about leadership and social organization, but the evidence of its effectiveness was all around them. The estate was peaceful, productive, and filled with beings who seemed genuinely happy to be there. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Davin, who approached with the kind of confident curiosity that characterized his interactions with all the estate's residents. "Are you the one who hurt Arian?" the child asked Terran with typical directness. "The one who rejected him and made him sad?" Terran's expression grew pained, but he answered honestly. "Yes, I am. I made some very bad choices, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Are you going to try to hurt him again?" Davin continued, his dragon abilities causing small flames to dance around his fingertips in response to his protective instincts. "No," Terran said firmly. "I'm going to try to make sure that what happened to him never happens to anyone else. I'm going to try to learn from his example and become someone who builds up rather than tears down." Davin studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if satisfied with what he had sensed. "Good, because Arian is family, and family protects each other." The child's simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate philosophical argument could have, and Arian could see its impact on Terran's expression. This was what love looked like when it was freely given rather than demanded, when it was based on choice rather than biological connection. As winter turned to spring, the temporary camp that had been established around the estate began to evolve into something more permanent. Representatives from multiple packs had requested permission to establish a settlement nearby, wanting to learn from the example of interspecies cooperation and inclusive community building. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Some of the more conservative elements among the attacking forces eventually departed, unable to reconcile their beliefs with what they had witnessed. But others stayed, drawn by the possibility of finding the same kind of acceptance and belonging that Arian had discovered. "We're creating something unprecedented," Kale observed one evening as they watched the sun set over the growing settlement. "Not just a community, but a model for how different species can coexist and thrive together." "It's what we always dreamed of," Arian replied, leaning against his partner's warmth while Davin played nearby with children from the new settlement, werewolf cubs, vampire fledglings, and even a few human youngsters whose families had been drawn to the area by reports of the unusual community. "Any regrets?" Kale asked, the question that had become a regular part of their evening conversations. "Only that it took rejection and exile for me to find this path," Arian said. "But even that served a purpose. I needed to lose everything I thought I wanted before I could recognize what I actually needed." The community continued to grow throughout the spring and summer, attracting beings from across the supernatural world who were seeking alternatives to traditional social structures. They established schools that taught interspecies cooperation alongside traditional subjects, workshops that combined different magical traditions, and governance structures that emphasized consensus building over dominance hierarchies. Most importantly, they created space for love to flourish in all its forms. Not just romantic partnerships between traditional pairings, but chosen families, interspecies relationships, and bonds based on shared values rather than mystical compulsion. "Look what we built," Arian said one evening as they stood together on the estate's highest balcony, looking out over a community that had grown to include hundreds of beings from dozens of different species. "Look what became possible when we chose love over fear." "Look what you built," Kale corrected gently, his arms wrapping around Arian from behind. "This all started with your courage to survive rejection, to heal from trauma, to open your heart to love again despite the risks involved." Davin joined them on the balcony, now 10 years old and growing into his dragon heritage with confidence and joy. "Are you talking about the old days again?" he asked with the kind of fond exasperation that children reserved for their parents' tendency to reminisce. "Just remembering how we got here," Arian replied, pulling the boy into their embrace. how we found each other and built something beautiful together. And now we're helping others find the same thing," Davin added, his practical nature keeping them focused on the present rather than dwelling on the past. "Tomorrow I'm going to help with the new arrivals. There's a family of Fae refugees who need help understanding how our community works." It was exactly the kind of generosity and inclusion that had made their community successful, and Arian felt a surge of pride for the young man Davin was becoming. The child who had once been abandoned for his dragon heritage was now helping others find the same acceptance and belonging that had saved him. As the years passed, their community became a beacon for supernatural beings throughout the known world. Treaties were signed that recognized their territory as neutral ground, scholars came to study their governance models, and most importantly, similar communities began to spring up in other regions. The rigid boundaries between species that had defined supernatural society for millennia began to soften as more and more beings discovered the benefits of cooperation over competition, acceptance over rejection, love over fear. "We changed the world," Arian observed on their 5th anniversary, as they watched children from a dozen different species playing together in the community's central square. "We chose love," Kale replied, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of someone who had found his life's true purpose. Everything else followed from that choice. As the sun set on another day in the community they had built together, Arian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had begun with what seemed like an ending, the destruction of everything he had believed about his future, the rejection that had left him broken and alone in the wilderness. But like all the best love stories, it had actually been a beginning, the foundation for a life that was richer, more meaningful, and more joyful than anything he could have imagined when he was still trying to fit into the narrow categories that others had created for him. Their love had survived rejection, exile, political opposition, and the weight of cosmic responsibility. It had grown from personal healing into community transformation, from individual happiness into a model for how the entire supernatural world could evolve. And at the heart of it all was the simple, radical truth that they had discovered together, that love freely chosen was more powerful than any bond imposed by fate, that family created through choice was stronger than any relationship defined by biology, and that the courage to be vulnerable in the service of love was the most revolutionary act of all. As they prepared for another night together, another day of building their community, another year of proving that different kinds of love could not only survive but thrive, Arian knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. After all, changing the world was never the work of a single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of countless smaller choices, each one building on the last, each one bringing them closer to the future they were working to create. Their love story had become something larger than themselves, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of acceptance, and the endless possibilities that opened up when beings were brave enough to love beyond the boundaries that others tried to impose. Epilogue: The Legacy of Love. 10 years after the battle that changed everything, the community that had grown around the estate had become something unprecedented in supernatural history. The settlement, now officially known as Haven's Gate, was home to nearly 3,000 beings from every known species, living together in harmony that would have been considered impossible just a generation earlier. Arian stood in the council chamber that had been built to accommodate the community's diverse leadership, watching delegates from various species work together on solutions to problems that affected everyone. The governance structure they had developed emphasized consensus building and mutual respect, creating space for every voice to be heard regardless of the speaker's species or social status. The Agricultural Committee's report, Sylvain announced, his role as community coordinator having evolved naturally from his position as the estate steward. The interspecies farming techniques have increased crop yields by 40% while reducing the environmental impact of our food production. Similar reports followed from committees focused on education, defense, trade relations, and cultural preservation. Each one demonstrated the benefits of cooperation over competition, showing how diversity of perspective and ability led to innovations that no single species could have achieved alone. But perhaps the most significant development was the establishment of the Academy of Integrated Learning, where young beings from all species learn together, their education emphasizing cooperation and understanding rather than the traditional focus on species-specific knowledge and intergroup competition. Davin's graduating class includes representatives from 15 different species. Kale observed as they watched the young man who had become their son deliver a presentation on interdimensional magical theory. When we first found him, he thought he was alone in the world. Now he's helping to train the next generation of community leaders. At 20, Davin had grown into his dragon heritage with confidence and grace. His abilities fully developed but always used in service of the community rather than personal gain. He had chosen to specialize in diplomatic relations, using his unique perspective as someone who belonged to multiple worlds to help bridge differences between species and cultures. The influence is spreading, Arian noted, reviewing reports from similar communities that had been established throughout the supernatural world. We're receiving requests for assistance from groups in every major territory, beings who want to create their own versions of what we've built here. The ripple effects of their community's success had indeed reached far beyond their original settlement. Traditional supernatural societies were being forced to adapt as their members saw alternatives that offered greater freedom and fulfillment. Some had embraced change voluntarily, others had been pushed toward reform by internal pressure from their own people. Even the werewolf packs are starting to question the fated mate system, Taryn reported during his monthly visit to the community. The former alpha had become one of their most effective advocates, using his position as a traditional leader to encourage other packs to consider more flexible approaches to relationships and family structure. How are they handling it? Arian asked, genuinely curious about developments in the world he had left behind. With more openness than I expected, Taryn admitted. The younger generation especially is drawn to the idea that they can choose their own partners based on compatibility and love rather than mystical compulsion. We've had to develop new rituals to celebrate chosen bonds alongside traditional fated matings. It was exactly the kind of evolution that their community had hoped to inspire, not the destruction of existing traditions, but their expansion to include new possibilities for happiness and fulfillment. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A figure appeared in the council chamber's doorway, moving with the kind of otherworldly grace that marked him as fey nobility. His silver hair seemed to catch light that didn't exist, and his eyes held depths that suggested he had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Lord Sylvain of the Winter Court, Kale said, rising to greet the visitor with the formal courtesy due to fey royalty. To what do we owe this honor? I come bearing a message from the Eternal Council, Lord Sylvain replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to shimmer. The gathered representatives of all supernatural species have been watching your community's development with great interest. The Eternal Council was legendary among supernatural beings, a body of representatives from every major species that met perhaps once every century to address issues that affected all of them. For them to take notice of Haven's Gate was unprecedented. What kind of message? Arian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. An invitation, Lord Sylvain replied with a slight smile. The council wishes to offer formal recognition of your community as a neutral territory under the protection of all supernatural governments. More importantly, they want to establish a permanent diplomatic mission here, using Haven's Gate as a model for interspecies cooperation on a global scale. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a personal love story between an exiled Omega and a vampire lord had evolved into something that could reshape the fundamental structure of supernatural civilization. There's more, Lord Sylvain continued. The council has also voted to establish the Order of Chosen Bonds, a new organization dedicated to supporting beings who seek alternatives to traditional relationship structures. They want the three of you to serve as its founding members. Arian felt a surge of emotion that was difficult to categorize: pride, amazement, and a deep satisfaction that their personal journey had become something that could help others find their own paths to happiness. We accept, Kale said, speaking for all of them, both the recognition and the responsibility that comes with it. As Lord Sylvain departed to carry their acceptance back to the Eternal Council, the three of them stood together in the council chamber, processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. When I found you in that auction house, Kale said, his voice soft with memory, I thought I was simply rescuing someone who needed help. I never imagined that saving you would lead to transforming the entire supernatural world. When you rejected me, Arian said to Taryn, who had remained for the historic moment. I thought my life was over. I never imagined that losing everything I thought I wanted would lead me to find everything I actually needed. When I found you in the forest, Davin added, joining their conversation with the easy familiarity of someone who had always been part of their family. I thought I was just looking for a place to belong. I never imagined that I'd end up helping to create a new kind of civilization. The recognition of their community's significance was gratifying, but it was the personal bonds they had forged that truly mattered. They had proven that love could transcend every boundary that tradition tried to impose, that family could be created through choice rather than inherited through biology, that the courage to be vulnerable in the service of love was indeed the most revolutionary act of all. As evening fell over Haven's Gate, Arian and Kale walked together through the streets of the community they had helped to build, greeting neighbors from dozens of different species, stopping to admire the work of artists who were creating entirely new forms of beauty by combining traditions from multiple cultures. Any regrets? Kale asked, the question that had become a tradition over their years together. Only that we can't go back and tell our younger selves that everything was going to work out even better than we dared to hope, Arian replied, taking his partner's hand as they walked. That love really is stronger than fear, that acceptance really is more powerful than rejection, that the future really can be better than the past. Davin joined them as they reached the estate's original grounds, now serving as the historical center of the larger community. Are you two getting sentimental again? He asked with the fond exasperation that had become his trademark when dealing with their tendency to reminisce. Just grateful, Arian said, pulling their son into the embrace that had become their family's signature gesture. Grateful for the journey that brought us together, grateful for the community we've built, grateful for the love that made it all possible. As they stood together under the stars, surrounded by the sounds of a thriving community that existed because they had chosen to love each other despite every obstacle that had been placed in their path, Arian reflected on the words that had become Haven's Gate's unofficial motto. Love freely chosen is more powerful than any bond imposed by fate. It was a truth they had discovered through personal experience, proven through community building, and were now sharing with the entire supernatural world. And as they prepared for the next chapter of their story, the work of helping other communities find their own paths to acceptance and cooperation, they knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. Their love story had become something larger than themselves, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of acceptance, and the endless possibilities that opened up when beings were brave enough to love beyond the boundaries that others tried to impose. The future was bright with possibility, and they would face it together, partners, parents, and pioneers of a new kind of civilization built on the radical proposition that everyone deserved to be loved for exactly who they were.